I have attended 412 dinner parties. I know that number because I kept a record, beginning in 1881, in a small leather journal that my husband considered an eccentricity and my social secretary considered an indispensable professional document. 412 dinner parties, not counting luncheons, not counting balls, not counting the afternoon calls that consumed 3 days of every week from October through April for the better part of 30 years. 412 evenings of the correct china and the correct flowers and the correct seating arrangement and the correct conversation. And I am here to tell you that correct is the most exhausting word in the English language. My name is Eleanor Constance Fairfax. I was born Eleanor Constance Howe on the 22nd of March, 1858, in Providence, Rhode Island, the eldest daughter of a dry goods merchant who did well enough that his daughters were educated beyond what was strictly necessary and married above what was strictly expected. Eldest daughter, yes, and fortunate. I married Robert Aldous Fairfax in June of 1878. I was 20 years old. He was 38. He owned, at the time of our marriage, a steel fabricating operation in Pittsburgh, a controlling interest in 2 smaller manufacturing concerns in Ohio, and a house on Fifth Avenue in New York that his first wife had decorated in a style I can only describe as an argument between France and Egypt that neither country won. I redecorated it within the year. That was my first act as Mrs. Robert Aldous Fairfax, and it told me something about myself that I have spent 40 years confirming. I am a woman who, when handed a situation, immediately begins to improve it. This quality made me an exceptional social manager and an occasionally difficult wife, and I have made my peace with both of those things. Robert was not a subtle man. He was large and loud, and entirely certain of his own judgment, which was, in matters of business, usually correct, and in matters of everything else, a more complicated question. He had come from nothing, from a Pennsylvania farm, with bad soil and worse weather, and he had made himself, through intelligence and ferocity and a willingness to work in a way that men born to comfort rarely understand, into one of the 20 wealthiest men in New York. He was proud of this. He was openly, completely, unapologetically proud of this, in a way that old money found vulgar, and I found, in my better moments, genuinely admirable. He gave me money, and he gave me the house, and he gave me a largely free hand, and in return he expected the social operation of our household to function at the level his wealth demanded and his ambitions required. This was, in the language of the Gilded Age, a transaction. It was also, in practice, a full-time occupation requiring more intelligence and stamina and political skill than most of the business operations Robert managed directly. I want to explain what running a great house in New York in the 1880s actually involved, because I think it is understood as decoration, and it was not decoration, it was management. The house on Fifth Avenue had 22 rooms in regular use, and another 9 that were seasonal or occasional. It ran on a staff of 14, a butler, a housekeeper, a cook of the French variety who was temperamental in proportion to his talent, 3 kitchen maids, 2 parlor maids, 2 housemaids, a lady's maid who was mine alone, a coachman, a groom, and a man whose title was footman, but whose actual function was to manage the gap between every other position and the demands that fell between them. 14 people, their wages, their hierarchy, their grievances, their occasional romantic entanglements with one another, their illnesses and absences, and the cascading effects of those absences on a household that had to function at the same level regardless of what was happening below stairs. I knew every one of them by name. I knew their families. I knew which of the kitchen maids had a mother in poor health in Brooklyn and needed occasional afternoons free, and I knew which of the housemaids was being courted by the groom, which I permitted within reason and monitored within necessity. I knew that the French cook, whose name was Emile, and who was worth every difficult thing about him, had a particular sensitivity about the sourcing of his cream, and that if the cream was not from the correct dairy, the quality of his sauces suffered in ways that would be noticed by exactly the people it was most important not to disappoint. These were not trivial concerns. The dinner party was the primary instrument of social and political negotiation in the world Robert and I occupied. Who sat where at a table of 18 was not a domestic question. It was a statement of alliances, a map of obligations, a signal to every person in the room about their standing relative to every other person in the room. I have seen friendships of 20 years strained by a seating arrangement, not because the people involved were petty, or not only because of that, but because in a world where social position was genuinely consequential, the symbols of that position carried real weight. Mrs. Astor's List. I imagine you have heard of it. The 400, the number of people who could fit comfortably in Caroline Astor's ballroom, which became, through the alchemy of social mythology, the number of people who constituted New York society in its legitimate form. I was on the list. I want to be honest about what being on the list meant and what it cost. It meant invitations. It meant the right rooms at the right times, access to the people whose access to other people created the conditions in which Robert's business interests could flourish or be impeded. New York in the 1880s was a city where who you knew and who knew you was not a supplement to commerce, but a prerequisite for it. The banks were run by men who socialized with other men who sat on the boards of the companies those banks financed. The contracts were discussed at dinner before they were signed in offices. The alliances that determined which enterprises succeeded and which were quietly starved of capital were formed in drawing rooms, at balls, on the promenades of Newport in August. Robert understood this perfectly. He had understood it from the moment he arrived in New York with his Pittsburgh money and his Pennsylvania vowels and his fierce determination to be taken seriously. I was the instrument of that understanding. I say that without bitterness, because it is simply the truth of what the arrangement was. Robert's money bought the house and the staff and the chef and the position. My intelligence and my labor and my knowledge of how that world operated made the position function. We were, in the purely practical sense, partners. In the personal sense, we were something more complicated and rather less equal, and I will come to that. The Newport summers were their own education. We took a cottage, and I use that word as Newport used it, which is to say, a house of 30 rooms overlooking the ocean. From 1882 onward, and the months of July and August were a concentrated version of everything the New York season contained, compressed into 8 weeks, and conducted in a slightly looser register that was nonetheless no less strategic for its apparent informality. The lawn parties, the yacht races, the casino, which was not a gambling establishment, but a social club, where the afternoons were spent in a careful performance of leisure that was more exhausting than most people's labor. I was good at Newport. I was good at all of it, if I am honest. I had a facility for the social management of complicated people in proximity to one another, a skill for understanding what a room needed and providing it before the need became visible, a memory for the details, birthdays, preferences, old grievances, family sensitivities, that make the difference between a hostess and a great hostess. Mrs. Astor herself said to me, in the summer of 1886, that I had the finest instinct for a room of any woman she had met in 20 years. I have held that sentence in my memory since, not out of vanity, or not only out of vanity, but because it came from a woman whose opinion on that subject was the only one in New York that fully mattered, and because I had worked for it. I want to tell you about the cost of it. Not the financial cost, which was considerable, and which Robert absorbed without complaint because the returns were legible in his balance sheets. The other cost, the cost that did not appear in any ledger. The self, I mean the self specifically, the private interior life of a woman who spends 30 years performing a version of herself for the benefit of other people's assessments. I was Eleanor Fairfax at every dinner, every ball, every morning call, every summer afternoon at Newport, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, perfectly calibrated to the requirements of the room, and the woman who had opinions that were not her husband's, and doubts that were not respectable, and a capacity for anger at the conditions of her existence that she had learned, very early and very thoroughly, to contain. That woman existed in the margins, in the half hour before sleep, in the carriage sometimes, between one obligation and the next. I had a friend named Dorothea Marsh, who understood this without my having to explain it, which is the definition of a true friend in any era. Dorothea was the wife of a railroad man and had been in New York society longer than I had, and had arrived, by the time I knew her well, at a philosophical position regarding the whole enterprise that I found both clarifying and somewhat frightening. She said at lunch one afternoon in 1891 that the women of our world were the most elaborately kept and the most thoroughly confined creatures in the history of civilization, and that the elaborateness of the keeping was specifically designed to prevent the confinement from being noticed. I thought about that sentence for weeks. I am thinking about it now. The children. I should tell you about the children because the children were the part of it that was not performance, or not primarily performance, and therefore the part that cost the most. I had 3 children with Robert. A son, William, born in 1879, who was at school from the age of 8 and at Harvard from the age of 17, and who became, in time, a version of his father with better manners and slightly less ferocity, which is to say a successful and somewhat diminished man. A daughter, Frances, born in 1881, who was clever in the way that I had been clever at her age, which is to say, in ways the world she was being prepared for had no particular use for. And a second son, Henry, born in 1884, who died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1887 at 3 years old. Henry. I will not speak about Henry at length because I am 81 years old, and the grief for a child does not diminish in the way that other griefs diminish, and I know my own limits on this subject. What I will say is that I sat at the dinner table 10 days after Henry died and hosted 16 people because there was an obligation that could not be canceled without a social consequence that Robert judged unacceptable, and I managed that dinner with the full competence the occasion required, and not one of the 16 people at my table knew what it cost me to sit there. That is the sentence I want you to hold. Not one of the 16 people at my table knew what it cost me to sit there. That is what it was to be a woman in my position in that world. Robert died in 1904. He was 64 years old. He died as he had lived, suddenly, loudly, in the middle of something else, specifically a business meeting in his office on Broadway, from which he did not emerge. I was 46 years old. I was a widow with a house and a fortune, and for the first time since June of 1878, no one to whom I was required to be anything in particular. I did not retire from society. That would have been a kind of surrender to the idea that I had been doing it only for Robert, and that was not entirely true. I had made something of my own in those rooms, something that had my intelligence and my taste and my judgment in it, and I was not prepared to abandon it simply because the man whose money had funded it was gone. I continued. I contracted somewhat. Fewer large dinners, more selective guest lists, a shorter Newport season. I began to use my position for things that had nothing to do with Robert's business interests and everything to do with my own. I supported the settlement house movement. I used my drawing room for meetings that some of my contemporaries found puzzling and a few found offensive. I became, gradually and without announcing it, a woman who used the access she had built over 30 years for purposes that were not on the original list of approved purposes, and I found that the position, once established, was difficult for even the most conservative of my acquaintances to entirely revoke. Frances married in 1903, a year before her father died. She married a man I approved of, which in the new century meant a man she had chosen herself, and who met my standard of basic decency and genuine regard for her, which I placed above all other considerations. She has had a good life. I am satisfied with that. William runs the business interests. He runs them ably. I am 81 years old, and I live in the house on Fifth Avenue, which has been redecorated twice since I first attacked it in 1879, and which is quieter now than it has ever been in my adult life, and which I find I prefer this way. 412 dinner parties. I do not know what the correct number is for a life. I do not know whether there is a correct number. I know that I did the work I was given with everything I had, and that some of the work was worthy of what it cost, and some of it was not, and that sorting between those two categories has been the project of my old age. I am still sorting. I expect I will be sorting until the end.